I didn't say when I was a little girl that I hoped to grow up one day and have a serial killer for a brother. I didn't want that. That's not the life I had hoped for. I just cannot believe that someone I loved so much and had such a piece of my heart could do something so vile. I think I just never wanted to see my brother as that type of monster.
I tied the mom up, and then I tied the little girl up. I put a chair in the bathroom, and then I put the girl in the chair and tied her to it. I went back to the lady, and I had sex with her. I cut the cord off the coffee pot, tied it around her neck after I choked her with my hands. This just shows how horrible this case was and how brutal, just brutal.
There's quite a bit of blood in there. You can tell that she'd been hit in the head several times. And she had blood streaming down her face and her hair. And when I started to take the photograph, she kind of turned and looked up at me. It's kind of like seeing someone rise from the dead.
I think the details of that day are just engraved in me and part of me. I don't know how I survived something like that. It's amazing that I was able to pull through that. And I remember it. This is from a scrapbook that I made for Jack. This is one of my favorite pictures because when we were younger, we would go to this amusement park and it had rides and carnival games, and Jack figured out how to win one of the games. And once he figured it out, he won us both these big bears and all these things, and he was just so happy. Yeah, that's the brother I remember right there. Us having the fun and laughing and smiling. It's very sweet. This was just a special time of him just truly being a kid before the bad things started to happen. There has been times when I felt like I just can't do it anymore. I can't hear one more story. I can't see one more picture. I can't hear one more horrible thing said about my family or my brother. We grew up in a family of 7. I am the youngest of children, and Jack was my older brother by about 1.5 years. When we were little, Jack was truly my best friend because we were so close in age, and my brothers and sisters were so much older that we did everything together. When Jack was younger, he fit in just like the rest of us. But he did have some, emotional issues, and so sometimes he would get angry. There were times when you just didn't know if you were getting the good side of Jack or the bad side of Jack. When he was mad, and he didn't look like himself.
Hand me the remote.
Come on, Jack, there's only 10 minutes left.
His eyes would just get hollow. He'd get quiet. It's like the calm before the storm. And his fits of rage were fits of rage. Like, they always involved violence, whether he was hitting my dad, hitting my mom, hitting me, throwing someone up against a wall. It was scary. Jack got in trouble a lot. The cops were called to our house a lot of times. I started seeing Jack do violent things to animals. I started noticing Jack doing drugs. I remember the police took Jack away and sent him to a youth facility. His anger just kept continuing to grow. I don't think Jack was evil. I think Jack had deep, dark issues that caused him to do what he did. He didn't get specific on what was tormenting him, but he would say that things happened in his childhood and things happened and he couldn't escape it. I think he did evil things. It's going to be very hard for me to say that my brother was evil, but he did do evil things.
This just shows how horrible this case was and how brutal, just brutal. I still have trouble comprehending how any human being could do that to another human being. It's almost like, being there again, even though it was 25 years ago. This whole case began shortly after midnight on June the 7th, when a White County deputy received a call about a missing person. Mary Phillips worked at this accounting place in Balnog, so the deputy drove to that accounting place. When he arrived there, he saw her pickup parked in front of the building. At that point, I think he just got a gut feeling that, hey, this may not end well. You got a mother and daughter that haven't been seen or heard from since 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Here it is, 1 o'clock in the next morning. So the red flags are waving, so to speak. This one deputy went in and checked the lobby or the outer area. He could see Mary's body in there. He immediately shut the door, came back out and said, hey, we've got a homicide.
I was at home, of course. It was about 3:45 in the morning, and they contacted me and requested me to go down there to work the crime scene. As an investigator, I've always kind of had a habit of going in, and when I go in and start taking photographs, I observed her body lying on the floor. Her hands were tied behind her, and she had a white electrical cord around her neck, and she was nude from the waist down. I assumed at that time that it was a rape and a homicide. You get used to seeing different types of crimes, and I had seen several of them. I've seen a lot of really brutal crimes, but yeah, this one was. It was different. One of the other investigators that was there with me opened the door to the bathroom. And at that point, he said, the young girl is in here. When I opened the door, I could see her, in the chair, kind of slumped over. There was quite a bit of blood in there. You can tell that she'd been hit in the head several times, and she had blood streaming down her face and her hair. I assumed that she was dead at that point. And I was taking the photograph, and when I started to take the photograph, she kind of turned and looked up at me. It was a shock, a real shock. You can imagine, it's kind of like seeing someone rise from the dead. Well, immediately I told the other officers that we need to get an ambulance down there, and that she was still alive.
I don't know how I survived something like that. Was it my time? It took a few times after I heard the clicking noise to realize what it was. I wanted to move, but my body just wouldn't let me move. And so then I just stopped and listened. And then that's when I told myself that clicking noise, I said, is someone taking a picture? I turned my head, and when I did, someone said, this one's alive. And I just sat there for a second, just. And I said, can you untie me, please? I have a scar that starts on the side of my face here, and it goes all the way up through my hair. And these are the scars that are left on my forehead here. I have one that goes all through my hairline, and then I have a real big indentation right here in my skull.
Do you know how long you were in that building by yourself?
No, I've never added up how long.
It's about 12 hours.
When I took the photo, she kind of turned her head to the left and looked up at me. And it was just a photo of, her face and her eye. Her hands are bound behind her back and tied to a chair. I was telling her what I was going to do. I told her I was going to cut the wires loose and cut her loose and get her out of there and take her to the hospital. She asked about her mom, and when I told her that it just didn't need to worry about her mom, just need to worry about her right now. And I told her, if you would, just keep your eyes closed and hold tight to me. And so that's what we did.
What are you thinking about right now?
Well, the whole thing. And how it went down and what a brave girl she was.
I'm standing at that point, and he kind of interlocks his arm with mine, and he walks me out of the bathroom, and Mom was laying in the floor, and I had to step over her foot to get over her. It never registered that she was dead. I don't know. God let me get through that point. And then the ambulance showed up, and they put me in the ambulance. I don't remember anything else until I woke up from Children's Hospital and I was in ICU. They asked me to tell my story as to what happened. I think the details of that day are just engraved in me and part of me. There's the details that I do remember will always be with me, the words, everything. I was at work with my mom, and at some point, a man came walking in the door. He came in, and he walked in front of the desk, so Mom and I both just stepped back, and he pulled out his gun. He told her to lay flat on the ground. He went to the bathroom and got a chair, a little metal chair, and he told me to sit in it. So I sat in it, and he tied both my arms to the chair behind my back. And I said, "Don't hurt my mama." And he said, "I'm not gonna hurt your mama, I'm gonna hurt you." And that's when he got the butt of his gun and started beating me. And I guess I passed out. And when I came to, I'm just looking all around, and there's just blood absolutely everywhere. So I start yelling for Mom. And he came back in there. Then he strangled me, and I passed out again. I remember people kept asking me questions, and I was answering them, but I kept saying, "Where's my mom? Is my mom okay? And they would never answer me. And they asked me, who did it? And I do remember them asking me about him, and I told them specifically from the head to the toes, everything he was wearing, what he looked like, how long his hair was. And then I believe his eyes were brown, and then he had a teardrop tattoo on his face that I will always remember.
On the way over here this morning, I was thinking about this case. I've got a 11-year-old granddaughter that I picked up last night after took her home. And I was thinking, that's the age Lacey was when she was tied in that chair and beaten while her mother was dead or dying in the next room. I can't get my brain to go where Lacey's brain was that day. Ball Knob officer knew from the description that this was going to be Jack Jones. Anytime you're approaching a suspect, you're thinking What approach did I use to get this guy to talk to me about this crime? You think, how are we going to do this? But when I walked in, Jones just talked. He was just matter of fact, as I recall, just telling his story. And I pulled her pants and panties off, and I had sex with her. I cut the cord off the coffee pot and tied it around her neck after I choked her with my hands. I went back to the bathroom, and I hit the girl on the head with the pistol because I wanted to get revenge against the police because my wife had been raped and nothing had been done about it. The rapist is still walking the streets. Apparently an incident had happened with his wife and another guy.
I've been trying to make sense of how Jack could go from my fun-loving best friend as a kid to the murderer that he became. I just cannot believe that someone I loved so much and had such a piece of my heart could do something so vile. It was unforgivable in my mind that I could come from the same line of blood as someone so evil to do that. And I couldn't understand why. Couldn't understand why he could do something so hurtful. It was devastating. To this day, I just still don't understand. Just don't understand.
On his knees and kind of put his arms on me, and he said, I just wanted to tell you that Mom is in heaven with Great Grandma. And I just looked at him, and of course people are crying, and I said, okay. And that's all I said. That picture just makes me feel it just makes me feel kind of like I did when I saw him in real life. Just seeing that face just makes me feel kind of like a scared little kid again. When I see that face in that picture, I see him, I have flashbacks of him yelling and just screaming at me. And I think, how dare you? How dare you?
soften up and realize that to become something other than what I remember. I was hurting. I was longing to have him back in my life. I can't explain it. I just didn't want him being alone. There was a phone call from the police. They proceeded to tell us that with the new DNA things going on, they were opening up cold cases, and a murder back in 1991 was traced back to Jack's DNA. I remember in 1991 coming home from work, and there was a story in the news about a young lady. Once I knew for a fact that Jack did it, when it was proven that Jack did it, I think right away my brain automatically went to, wow, there could be more. He was capable of doing too. Is there others that I just don't know about?
Did you ever think of him as a serial killer?
I think I just never wanted to see my brother as that type of monster. And I didn't want to think my brother was a serial killer. My brain went to the fact, what if he killed someone and the crime is unsolved and there's parents out there wanting an answer? And I'm like, I gotta see him. I gotta see him. So I went to visit him. I wanted him to tell me the truth. Jack, if you've done something and it's an unsolved crime, how would you feel living all these years not knowing what happened to your loved one? Is that fair? If you are in here telling me you're trying to do things right, you're trying to do good, then doing good means coming clean. He said, yeah, there's another one. He didn't give me any details, and I didn't want to know him right then. He just said, I will write you a letter one day. You'll know that it's the letter because I'm going to address it. He always wrote sis on the envelopes. It'll say Sherilyn, which is my real name. He said, when you see that letter come, you know that that's it. This is the letter that Jack always told me was going to come eventually. I met her riding bikes. We went to the beach, rode around down there, and came back up and into the park. And that's where it happened. White girl, red hair, maybe 110 pounds, 5'5". I believe she was found the next day or the following evening. There was a story in the newspaper. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that what I was reading was actually true. It was his confession for the murder of Regina Harrison. I went ahead and reached out to the detective. They were able to open up the case again with the advancements of the DNA system, and it was 100% match to Jack.
You know, just at a glance, it just looks like anybody else walking down the street. But you can't tell by looking at the outside what's going on the inside. And he decimated.
I wanted to see it happen to make sure it was done. You go 20-something years hearing that it's going to happen, and it never does. I've been this whole time without my mom, and by golly,
Do you feel guilt about not calling the police after you saw that news report?
Back in 1991, I saw the composite sketch that day. And if I would have said something to the authorities and turned my own brother in, the murder in Arkansas in 1995 would have never happened. If I would have said something, Mary would still be here. My brain never went there. My brain was, here's this troubled boy. In my heart, I couldn't fathom that he could do it. What is Lacey gonna think of me? I could have saved her mom. How do you live with that? I've rehearsed in my mind and in my journals for years. Just something I could say to Lacey. And every time I try to write something or think of something, it just sounds so awful coming off my tongue. How dare I? I'm so sorry that he took away so much from her. I didn't say when I was a little girl that I hope to grow up one day and have a serial killer for a brother. I didn't want that. That's not what I want. That's not the life I had hoped for. It's the life I was handed. I did the best with it as I could. And as angry as I was with him, I just couldn't walk away from it in the end. But I do pray that Lacey has found some peace in Jack's death.
think about
Dallas, Georgia heat of August 1985 did not just bake the red clay of Atlanta. It seemed to compress the very air inside a pristine suburban home in Buckhead, trapping a terrifying secret behind closed doors. It began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, not with a chaotic street robbery or an explosive home invasion, but with an absolute, suffocating silence that paralyzed one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. A luxury sedan sat parked in the concrete driveway of the prestigious Sterling estate, its driver's side window rolled halfway down, a half-empty glass of iced tea sweating profusely on the dashboard under the burning southern sun. Inside the residence, the master bedroom was bathed in a pale, golden light that crept through the heavy lace curtains, casting long, geometric shadows across a scene of sheer physical devastation. 28-year-old socialite and corporate heiress Evelyn Montgomery lay perfectly static on the plush, cream-colored carpet. She was a fixture of Atlanta's high society circuit, a visionary philanthropist whose family name was synonymous with banking empires, historic real estate holdings, and deep political connections. She was not a woman who associated with the city's burgeoning criminal underworld. She was a person of fastidious, near-obsessive structure, a perfectionist who meticulously logged her daily appointments and never left her security alarms undisarmed. When her private assistant entered the home 3 hours later, she didn't just walk into a crime scene. She stepped into a profound biological void. Evelyn had been strangled with a delicate silk scarf, her body arranged with a chilling, clinical precision that suggested the killer had not operated in a panic, but had executed a premeditated ritual before evaporating into the humid afternoon air. There was no signs of forced entry, no shattered window panes, no missing heirloom jewelry, and no foreign fingerprints left behind on the polished mahogany doorknobs. It was a phantom execution, a crime so surgically, flawlessly carried out that the Atlanta Police Department's Homicide Bureau stood entirely frozen before the vacuum for over 4 decades. The headlines slammed onto the front pages of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with a raw, sensational violence that mirrored the community's absolute panic. The Buckhead heiress murder, Homicide Bureau stalled, the ghost in the garden. Every wealthy associate, every corporate rival, and every prominent political figure who had frequented the exclusive country clubs of Peachtree Street became an immediate target of burning, whispered suspicion, causing legacy families to retreat behind massive iron gates, install state-of-the-art security systems, and hire private, armed bodyguards to shadow their children through the sun-drenched streets. The golden hours of the initial search sequence bled into frantic weeks, then into desperate, stagnant months, and eventually into the slow, agonizing crawl of a case turning completely cold. The files were bound in thick, heavy cardboard casings, stamped with the tragic, definitive ink of a cold case, and carried down to the damp, fluorescent-lit basement archives of the Central Police Headquarters on Peachtree Street, left to collect the fine, invasive dust of a changing century. 41 years of absolute, suffocating silence. 41 years of a mother dying with her eyes fixed on an empty telephone line, of a family fortune fractured by relentless private investigations, and of veteran homicide detectives retiring with the burning sting of an unpunished evil weighing heavily on their souls. The world moved on, radically transformed by glass skyscrapers, digital algorithms, and the fast-paced rush of the modern internet era. The old country clubs where Evelyn danced were demolished, her contemporary generation faded into old age, and the name Evelyn Montgomery became a tragic piece of local news folklore, a cautionary tale whispered by young investigators about the lethal cost of a perfect crime in the Deep South. But secrets buried within the genetic structure of human skin cells have a violent, explosive way of demanding light when the technology of a new century learns how to read the dead. The turning point did not come from a sudden deathbed confession or an accidental jailhouse informant. It came from a microscopic strand of degraded DNA extracted from the preserved silk scarf, a biological artifact that had sat in an envelope inside the evidence vault since 1985. Advanced genetic genealogy, a modern scientific miracle that maps the massive, interconnected family trees of the civilian populace through public ancestry databases, began to trace a phantom line through the generations. The digital trail did not just shock the community, it shattered Atlanta's modern social history, unmasking a highly respected, 74-year-old grandfather living under a completely fabricated identity in a quiet town in North Carolina, a man who had spent 4 decades breathing the fresh mountain air as a peaceful, God-fearing citizen, while his true history was a map of blood, revealing that the monster had never been a passing shadow, but had stolen a new life from the dead to outrun the law. The heavy, stifling atmosphere of late August 1985 did not merely blanket the sprawling, historic estates of Buckhead. It seemed to lock the entire city of Atlanta into a state of paranoid suspended animation. To fully grasp the terrifying weight of the genetic breakthrough that would eventually unravel this mystery 41 years later, the mind must strip away the digitized, glass and steel reality of the modern era and step directly into the raw, turbulent, and money-drenched landscape of the mid-1980s. Atlanta during this period was a city undergoing a fierce, hyper-accelerated identity crisis. A massive influx of corporate capital was rewriting the skyline along Peachtree Street. Old guard Southern families were fighting to maintain their historical dominance over the financial institutions, and a wave of raw, untraceable wealth was flowing through the newly expanded airport hub. It was an era of unchecked ambition, high-stakes corporate raiding, and hidden vices tucked away behind the pristine limestone facades of the city's elite enclaves. Yet, within this rapidly shifting social hierarchy, the Montgomery family stood as an unassailable bastion of old-world security. They were the architects of Atlanta's banking infrastructure, a dynasty whose lineage stretched back to the Reconstruction era and whose civic influence crossed into every major boardroom and legislative chamber in the state of Georgia. Evelyn Montgomery was the brilliant 28-year-old heiress to this sprawling legacy, a young woman who possessed not only an extraordinary financial inheritance, but a sharp, analytical mind that had earned her a seat on the board of the Montgomery Trust Company. She was a fixture at every high society gala, a patron of the arts, and a woman who moved through the world with an effortless, aristocratic grace that made her seem entirely detached from the grim realities of the city's rising crime rates. The afternoon she was murdered, August 20th, 1985, was marked by a suffocating heat wave that brought the city to a grinding, humid halt. Evelyn had returned to her secluded, brick estate on a quiet cul-de-sac in Buckhead at approximately 1:30 p.m., following a high-level lunch meeting with the Trust's senior financial analysts. Her itinerary for the rest of the day was supposed to be entirely private, a rare afternoon of solitude spent reviewing real estate development titles in her master suite before a scheduled dinner at the Piedmont Driving Club. She was a woman of fastidious, almost military discipline. She never left her security systems undisarmed without cause. She kept her private schedules locked in a leather-bound day planner, and she never opened her front door to unannounced visitors. When her personal assistant, a young woman named Sarah Collins, entered the residence at 4:45 p.m. to deliver the evening mail, the silence that greeted her was not the peaceful stillness of an empty home. It was a heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly cold biological vacuum. The front door was unlocked but completely undamaged, showing no scratches along the brass deadbolt or fractures in the heavy oak frame. The interior of the house was immaculately ordered, the air conditioning humming smoothly against the exterior heat, the faint scent of lavender wood polish hanging undisturbed in the air. But as Collins ascended the grand winding staircase and stepped past the threshold of the master suite, the calculated order of the estate dissolved into an absolute nightmare. Evelyn Montgomery lay perfectly static on the plush, cream-colored carpet beside her antique canopy bed. The room was bathed in a pale, golden light that filtered through the heavy lace curtains, casting long, geometric shadows across her body. She was dressed in a silk summer blouse, her hair slightly displaced, her eyes wide with a frozen, expressionless gaze of sudden, absolute terror. Wrapped tightly around her throat was a delicate, hand-painted Italian silk scarf, a piece of her own wardrobe that had been transformed into a lethal weapon with a chilling, clinical efficiency. The killer had not operated in a panicked frenzy. There were no defensive wounds beneath her fingernails, no torn clothing, no overturned furniture, and no signs of a desperate struggle for survival. The predator had caught her completely by surprise, executing a precise, swift assassination before evaporating into the humid afternoon air without leaving a single footprint behind in the manicured gardens outside. The initial forensic sweep of the crime scene, commanded by lead homicide detective Edward Vance, was a primitive and frustrating exercise that highlighted the severe technical limitations of the mid-1980s. In 1985, the concept of DNA profiling was a distant, theoretical concept confined to specialized research laboratories in Europe. It was not a tool available to a municipal police bureau facing a high-profile capital homicide. Investigators relied almost entirely on traditional physical evidence, latent fingerprints, blood typing from secretions, shoeprint casts, and trace fiber analysis. Vance and his team spent 48 hours dusting every square inch of the master suite with black carbon powders and silver nitrate solutions, but the smooth surfaces of the mahogany dressers, the crystal perfume bottles, and the brass door handles yielded absolutely nothing but Evelyn's own fingerprints and those of her domestic staff. The Italian silk scarf used to terminate her life was carefully removed by the medical examiner and packaged in a brown paper evidence envelope, but a microscopic examination under standard laboratory lenses revealed no usable foreign fibers, no hairs, and no blood that did not belong to the victim. The killer had worn smooth, tight gloves, leaving no skin oil or ridge details along the fabric. The back entry to the estate, which opened onto a dense perimeter of old-growth pine trees and historic stone walls, showed no signs of a forced breach. The security system had been manually disarmed using the correct 4-digit master code at exactly 1:42 p.m., just 12 minutes after Evelyn arrived home, proving with an absolute, terrifying certainty that the killer was either an intimate associate who possessed the security code or a person who had forced Evelyn to disarm the system at gunpoint before leading her up the stairs. The behavior profile of the victim completely rejected the narrative of a random robbery or a crime of sudden opportunity. Evelyn's diamond engagement ring, her solid gold Rolex watch, and thousands of dollars in cash inside her leather handbag resting on the kitchen counter were entirely untouched. This realization forced Detective Vance to a dark, unyielding conclusion. Evelyn Montgomery had been targeted with an absolute, professional premeditation by someone who understood her schedule, understood her security layout, and whose presence inside her bedroom did not trigger an immediate, instinctive scream for help. It was an execution designed to look like a phantom intrusion, a crime so perfectly insulated by its own lack of physical evidence that the Homicide Bureau found itself completely paralyzed before the void. The investigation quickly became a high-society political minefield that threatened to ignite the city's ruling infrastructure. Detective Vance and his team spent weeks cross-examining every prominent figure who frequented the exclusive clubs of Buckhead, Star Island, and the financial district. They interrogated ex-fiancés, rival real estate developers, senior banking partners, and the domestic staff who managed the daily operations of the estate. The pressure from the Montgomery family was relentless and overwhelming. They hired private intelligence operatives from London and Washington, offering a $500,000 reward, an astronomical fortune in 1985, for any tip that could break the wall of silence. The front pages of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran continuous, daily tickers tracking the number of days since the heiress had been taken, their headlines screaming with a raw, sensational violence. The Buckhead heiress slaughter, the ghost in the master suite, silence in the red clay. Among the individuals interviewed during those first frantic weeks of the search sequence was a 34-year-old rising star in the city's corporate real estate sector named Charles Vance, no relation to the detective, a handsome, smooth-talking operator who had recently formed a joint venture with the Montgomery Trust to develop a massive commercial shipping plaza near the Chattahoochee River. Charles was a frequent guest at the Montgomery estate, a man who had been seen drinking cocktails with Evelyn at the Piedmont Driving Club just 48 hours before her death. When interviewed by Detective Vance inside his walnut-paneled office on Peachtree Street, Charles was the absolute picture of a devastated, professional business associate, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his gold cufflinks, his voice carrying a deep, resonant sorrow. Evelyn was the brilliant future of our entire redevelopment project, Detective, Charles had whispered, leaning forward over his glass desk, his expression a masterpiece of concerned empathy. She possessed a financial mind that was completely unmatched in this city. We were building a new Atlanta together. If someone has taken her life to interfere with the trust's investments, they have committed an act of war against this entire community. I will instruct my corporate lawyers to give your team unrestricted access to our joint venture ledgers, our meeting minutes, and our internal correspondence files. His alibi for that Tuesday afternoon was considered rock solid by the primitive standards of 1985. He claimed he had been attending a private corporate luncheon at the Capital City Club with 3 prominent international bankers until 2:30 p.m., after which his personal chauffeur had driven him directly to his penthouse apartment in Midtown, where he spent the remainder of the evening reviewing construction contracts with 2 independent structural engineers. The engineers verified his timeline under oath. The club's valet logs showed his black luxury sedan clearing the gates at precisely 2:35 p.m., and in an era before automated license plate readers, cell tower pings, and ubiquitous surveillance cameras, there was no digital grid to challenge the validity of his movements. He was a wealthy, highly connected white-collar professional whose ambitions aligned perfectly with the city's economic growth. He was placed on the outer edge of the case file, classified as a close cooperative witness, and left behind as the investigation ground to a complete, agonizing halt. As the months bled into years, the frantic energy of the search sequence began to curdle into an administrative paralysis. The case file grew increasingly heavy, filling 4 cardboard archive boxes that were eventually carried down to the cold, fluorescent-lit basement vault of the police headquarters on Peachtree Street. There they sat for over 4 decades, stamped with the tragic, definitive ink of a cold case, while the city above them moved on, its memory of Evelyn Montgomery systematically erased by the rapid, dawn-dap velocity of new scandals, new Olympic developments, and the transformative march of a new century. The old country clubs where Evelyn danced were demolished, her contemporary generation faded into old age, and her name became a piece of local news folklore, a cautionary tale whispered by young homicide investigators about the lethal cost of a perfect crime in the Deep South. Evelyn's mother, an elegant matriarch named Eleanor Montgomery, turned her grief into a quiet, obsessive crusade that lasted for 20 years. She refused to alter a single detail of her daughter's estate, keeping the lawns manicured and the master suite locked like a museum of a frozen life. She spent millions on private investigators, forensic consultants, and handwriting analysts, tracking the growth of the developers who had profited from the restructuring of the Montgomery Trust lands after Evelyn's death. She died in 2005, her hands clenching a photograph of her daughter, her final words a whispered demand to her surviving attorneys to never allow the police archive boxes to be destroyed or forgotten. Meanwhile, Charles Vance did not merely survive the shifting corporate landscape of Georgia, he vanished from it. In the winter of 1989, just 4 years after the murder, as the state attorney's office began a quiet, preliminary audit into a multi-million-dollar tax fraud scheme connected to the Chattahoochee Shipping Plaza development, Charles Vance cleared his corporate bank accounts, abandoned his Midtown penthouse, and completely dissolved into the wind. He left behind a maze of empty shell companies, a ruined corporate legacy, and a furious board of directors. The FBI issued a federal fugitive warrant for his arrest on charges of interstate financial fraud, but his trail was stone-cold from the moment he stepped across the state line. He had skipped the grid so perfectly that it seemed he had never existed in the state's history, leaving investigators to assume he had fled to South America or changed his name in Europe. What Charles Vance failed to calculate, what his decades of successful flight and his completely refabricated life could not protect him against, was the absolute, unyielding arithmetic of his own biology. Every time a human being moves through a space, every time a hand touches a fabric or a throat exhales a breath, a permanent genetic record is left behind, a microscopic cellular scroll that the modern world has learned how to read with a terrifying, supernatural precision. In February of 2026, as part of a newly funded federal initiative to apply advanced genetic genealogy to unsolved cold case homicides in the American South, a forensic technician at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's state laboratory pulled the paper evidence envelope containing the Italian silk scarf out of its dark cardboard box. The biological clock had officially reached its final countdown, and the perfect crime of 1985 was about to meet the unyielding memory of a digital machine. The laboratory environment within the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's forensic headquarters in Decatur was completely devoid of historical sentiment or theatrical drama. It was a space defined by the flat, blinding glare of overhead ultraviolet sterilization bars, the low, continuous hum of negative pressure HEPA filters, and the clinical absolute of molecular science. In February 2026, when senior forensic geneticist Dr. Eris Thorne pulled the 41-year-old paper evidence envelope containing the Italian silk scarf from cardboard archive box number 84, he was not reviewing a tragic high society legend. He was looking at a primitive substrate, a tightly woven lattice of vintage Mediterranean silk fibers that had spent nearly half a century sealed in a dark, climate-controlled vault, holding onto a microscopic biological signature that the human eyes of 1985 had been entirely blind to see. Under the clinical magnifying elements of a multispectral digital imaging system, the hand-painted Italian fabric revealed its true forensic texture. In 1985, the crime scene technicians had focused exclusively on visible stains, foreign hairs, and macroscopic fibers, elements that could be manually categorized under standard optical lenses. But modern genetic genealogy does not require a visible pool of blood or a massive deposit of biological material. It functions within the realm of the invisible, utilizing the concept of touch DNA, the microscopic, dehydrated epithelial skin cells that are systematically shed from a perpetrator's fingers whenever friction is applied to an object. When the killer had wrapped that silk scarf around Evelyn Montgomery's throat, pulling the fabric taut with a clinical, unyielding force, the intense friction had embedded thousands of his skin cells deep into the porous, structural weave of the silk threads. The isolation and extraction sequence was a high-precision chemical operation that required 3 days of absolute technological patience. Using a specialized, low-frequency vacuum collection matrix, Dr. Thorne's team systematically washed the interior knots of the scarf with a sterile, enzymatic buffer solution designed to release the embedded epithelial cells without degrading the underlying fabric structure. The fluid was then passed through a high-speed centrifugal filtration array, condensing the biological material into a single, microscopic drop of clear liquid at the bottom of a high-security plastic vial. "The biological yield is low, Marcus," Dr. Thorne stated, his voice dropping into a flat, analytical baritone through the intercom speaker as investigator Marcus Thorne, his brother, the lead detective assigned to the state's cold case unit, watched the process from behind the double-paned observation glass. "We are dealing with a highly fragmented, 41-year-old sample that has suffered from an initial phase of thermal degradation before it was brought into the evidence vault. Standard short tandem repeat profile matching is completely out of the question. The loci are too fractured to generate a valid entry for the state's criminal index system. If we run this sample through the traditional law enforcement databases, the machine will simply reject it as unreadable noise. Then we bypass the criminal index entirely, Eris," Investigator Thorne replied, his voice a low, gravel-heavy vibration against the glass. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the stainless steel window frame. "We aren't looking for a direct match against a convicted felon anymore. We know Charles Vance didn't have a criminal record when he skipped the state line in 1989. He was a white-collar operator whose slate was clean until the fraud audit. We need to look at his family tree. We need to turn his own bloodline into a net. To achieve this, the laboratory initiated a process known as whole genome sequencing, WGS, utilizing an advanced next-generation sequencer capable of reading over 1 million specific single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, across the entire human genetic blueprint. While standard forensic matching looks at 20 distinct points of comparison to identify an individual, SNP tracking maps the entire ancestral geography of the donor, generating a massive, highly detailed digital file that contains the complete hereditary history of a bloodline, including eye color, geographical origins, and deep familial connections stretching back through multiple generations. By March 12, 2026, the complete digital SNP profile of the Buckhead predator had been compiled, converted into an encrypted text file, and uploaded into the secure operational portal of the world's largest public genetic genealogy databases. Civilian platforms containing millions of DNA profiles voluntarily submitted by citizens across the globe seeking to map their family lineages and discover long-lost relatives. The software did not search for a perfect one-to-one match. It began an automated, high-speed algorithmic comparison, scanning the millions of digital branches to locate individuals who shared significant blocks of identical centimorgans, the scientific unit used to measure the length of shared DNA segments between biological relatives. The results did not drop onto the task force's terminal with a sudden, dramatic chime. Instead, the software began to draw a complex, silver-colored geometric matrix across the screen, linking the unknown donor profile to a cluster of third and fourth cousins residing in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. "The digital net has its first anchor, Marcus," Agent Cruz reported, pulling up a sprawling, multi-tiered genealogical chart that looked like a massive, glowing spiderweb of names, birth registries, and death certificates. She pointed her tablet toward a specific branch of the family tree located in a rural county near the Blue Ridge Mountains. The algorithm identified a high-density ancestral cluster. The donor shares approximately 92 centimorgans with a 64-year-old schoolteacher in Knoxville and 84 centimorgans with a retired diesel mechanic in Asheville. According to the laws of genetic inheritance, this means the killer shares a set of great-great-grandparents with these individuals. We have isolated the family line to the Vance Caldwell lineage of Buncombe County. For 3 days, the task force worked in tandem with professional forensic genealogists, performing a reverse engineering operation of absolute administrative brilliance. They did not look forward through time. They moved backward, utilizing census records from the early 20th century, marriage registries from the mid-century, and faded military draft cards to trace every male descendant who had branched out from that specific North Carolina route. They mapped the brothers, the uncles, and the sons, systematically eliminating individuals who had died in childhood, those who had served overseas during the mid-'80s, and those whose geographic locations could be definitively verified elsewhere on August 20th, 1985. By the evening of March 18th, the sprawling forest of names had been violently pruned down to a single, solitary branch. The Vance Caldwell line had produced a male child born in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1951, a child named Charles Edward Vance. The digital data matched his historical timeline with an absolute, terrifying precision. He was the exact age of the rising corporate real estate star who had danced with Evelyn Montgomery at the Piedmont Driving Club. He was the exact individual who had vanished into the wind in 1989 when the federal tax fraud audit closed around his shipping plaza development. The genetic trail had unmasked his true family name, but it had left the investigators facing a massive, 37-year-old void. Where was he now? He didn't just change his name when he stepped across the state line, Marcus. Detective Miller reported, sitting down heavily at the command table, his fingers flying across a terminal that linked directly to the Social Security Administration's death master file and national credit registries. He committed identity theft against the dead. In May of 1989, just 3 weeks after the FBI issued the federal fugitive warrant for his financial frauds, a fraudulent application was filed in rural Virginia for a duplicate Social Security card under the name of Thomas Raymond Arthur. The true Thomas Arthur was a child who had passed away in a tragic farming accident in 1956 at the age of 5. Charles Vance found his headstone, found his birth registry, and used the primitive, undigitized filing systems of the late 80s to resurrect that identity, building a completely clean historical footprint from a ghost. Under the stolen name of Thomas Arthur, the fugitive had completely re-engineered his existence, erasing every trace of his high society Atlanta prestige. He did not return to the high-stakes world of corporate real estate development or luxury penthouses. He understood that multi-million-dollar banking transactions left a digital paper trail that modern federal agencies could track with ease. Instead, he transformed himself into a quiet, blue-collar craftsman, settling in an isolated, mountain town named Waynesville, tucked deep within the temperate rainforests of western North Carolina. He bought a small, timber-frame cottage along the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, opened a small independent antique wood restoration shop on Main Street, and lived a life of deliberate, lower-middle-class anonymity. For 37 years, he had lived as a peaceful, God-fearing citizen within that mountain community. He paid his taxes on time under his stolen Social Security number. He attended Sunday services at the local Methodist church, and he was known by his neighbors as a gentle, quiet older man who spent his weekends cultivating heirloom tomatoes in his backyard garden and volunteering at the local animal shelter. He had compartmentalized the year 1985 so perfectly that the name Evelyn Montgomery had never crossed his lips in nearly 4 decades. He had outrun Edward Vance, outrun the FBI's financial fraud division, and outrun the memory of the city of Atlanta. He was a grandfather, a respected craftsman, and an unassailable pillar of his small mountain town, entirely oblivious to the reality that his own skin cells were currently screaming his true identity into a federal computer server 300 miles away. The current address is verified, Marcus. Agent Cruz stated, displaying a high-resolution satellite image of a secluded driveway hidden beneath a dense canopy of old-growth oak and hickory trees along the slope of the mountain. He's 74 years old now. He walks with a slight limp from an old knee injury, but he still operates the wood restoration shop every day from 9 to 5. The local post office confirmed that he receives his mail under the name Thomas Arthur, and his utility accounts have been active under that identity since 1994. He believes his safety is absolute. He thinks the passage of 41 years has turned his crime into a forgotten piece of old newsprint. The safety ends tomorrow morning, Elena, Investigator Thorne said, his voice dropping into a stone-cold, unyielding cadence that carried the absolute authority of the state's power. He reached down, picking up his service weapon from the desk and checking the magazine with a sharp, mechanical click that broke the quiet atmosphere of the room. We aren't going to send a local sheriff's deputy to knock on his door and ask for identification. A man who has lived a lie for 37 years will have an escape perimeter calculated down to the inch. We deploy a joint tactical arrest team into Waynesville before sunrise. We take him in his driveway, before he can reach for a tool or step inside his vehicle. Let's go bring the ghost of Buckhead back to the red clay. As the tactical vans and the mobile tracking units began to load their equipment in the secure garage beneath the Decatur headquarters, the clock was ticking down its final, definitive hours for the fugitive in the mountains. Charles Vance sat on his porch in North Carolina, watching the evening mist settle over the Blue Ridges, entirely unaware that the microscopic trimmings of an old silk scarf had just pulled his true name out from the dark, turning his quiet paradise into an absolute trap from which no amount of deception could buy a single extra second of evasion. The pre-dawn mist hanging over the Great Smoky Mountains did not drift. It clung to the steep, densely forested slopes of Waynesville, North Carolina, like a heavy, gray shroud, dampening the gravel roads and freezing the mountain air into a biting, humid chill. At 5:15 a.m. on Tuesday, June 23, 2026, the absolute, rustic serenity of the isolated valley remained completely undisturbed by the brewing operational storm. Inside the small, timber frame cottage along the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, 74-year-old Charles Vance, known to his neighbors for 37 years exclusively as the quiet, gentle antiquewood craftsman Thomas Arthur, was beginning his morning routine. He stood at his old porcelain kitchen sink, pouring a cup of black coffee, his eyes tracking the dim silhouette of his heirloom tomato garden emerging through the gray fog outside. He was a man who moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his right knee carrying a faint, arthritic stiffness that was his only visible concession to the passage of time. To any observer, he was a peaceful, God-fearing grandfather whose existence was defined by the scent of linseed oil, aged cedar, and the soft, rhythmic scraping of his manual wood planes. He had built a fortress of absolute normalcy out of a stolen life, burying his true identity beneath the name of a 5-year-old child who had died in a tragic farming accident in 1956. He had compartmentalized the year 1985 so perfectly that his mind had completely stopped expecting a knock at the door. He truly believed that the 4 decades separating him from the plush, cream-colored carpet of the Buckhead Master Suite had turned his crime into an unreadable piece of ancient newsprint. He had outrun the detectives. He had outrun the FBI. He had outrun the memory of the city of Atlanta. He had no inkling that a mile down the mountain highway, a heavily armed tactical column was currently moving through the fog with an absolute, unyielding mechanical precision. The tactical deployment, coordinated by lead investigator Marcus Thorne and FBI Special Agent Elena Cruz, was an exercise in overwhelming operational force wrapped in total administrative secrecy. If Vance caught even a fleeting glimpse of a local sheriff's patrol unit or a marked state police cruiser, a man who had successfully managed a fugitivity layout for nearly 40 years would instantly trigger an escape perimeter calculated down to the square inch. He had lived a lie for half his life. He knew how to read the wind, and he knew how to disappear into the dense, old-growth timber of the national forest behind his property if the grid began to tighten. Thorne had bypassed the local municipal channels entirely, deploying an elite, joint federal-state tactical enforcement stack that moved in a convoy of 4 unmarked, matte black utility vans with their headlights and sirens completely blacked out. Inside the lead transport vehicle, the air was thick with the distinct, electric tension of an impending ambush, smelling of tactical gun oil, cold sweat, and the sharp odor of high-energy caffeine drinks. Thorne checked the digital interface of his tactical terminal, which displayed a real-time thermal infrared satellite tracking feed of the cottage. The target was a single, hot orange silhouette moving slowly between the kitchen and the rear workshop window. The state's legal net was completely flawless, and the federal arrest warrant for first-degree capital murder, kidnapping, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution was locked into the command server with a digital timestamp that read 5:22 a.m. The rear containment perimeter is established, Marcus. Agent Cruz reported through her secure throat microphone, her voice a low, driving whisper that carried zero hesitation. She pointed a gloved finger toward the mapping screen, where 4 blue tracking icons had settled into the dense brush line along the north ridge of the property. The sniper elements from the North Carolina State Police Tactical Unit have their glass focused on the back exit door and the workshop windows. If he attempts to bolt toward the timberline with an antique rifle or a utility tool, he walks directly into a hard roadblock. The main driveway column is moving into the final approach sequence now. We hit him the exact second he steps out onto his porch to load his truck for the workshop. We don't deploy sirens or flashlights until the irons are locked onto his wrists, Elena, Thorne commanded, his fingers tightening around the cold metal chassis of his service weapon as the transport van turned silently off the paved highway onto the damp, loose gravel of the mountain driveway. A man of his narcissistic intelligence will instantly recognize a federal raid blueprint. He will try to use the geography of that house to force a lethal, armed standoff, or he will destroy whatever physical records he has hidden inside his wall panels. We catch him in the open, before his hand can reach his keys or a tool. The transport vans rolled down the winding gravel track under the dark canopy of oak and hickory trees, their heavy tires producing nothing but a soft, rhythmic crunching sound that was completely swallowed by the loud roar of the mountain river rushing through the valley bottom. The column halted 50 yards from the cabin, hidden behind a thick screen of old-growth rhododendron bushes. The side panels of the van slid open with a synchronized, mechanical click that was almost entirely silent, and 8 tactical operators from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and the Georgia State Patrol flooded out onto the wet dirt, their matte black body armor reflecting the dim, violet pre-dawn light. They moved in a single, tight tactical stack, their weapons brought up to their shoulders, their heavy combat boots striking the damp grass with a synchronized, dawn-dap rhythm that carried the absolute, unyielding authority of the state. Thorne led the column, his gold investigator shield displayed prominently over his tactical vest, his eyes locked on the front door of the timber-frame cottage. At exactly 5:32 a.m., the front door of the cabin swung open and the elderly fugitive stepped out onto the wooden porch, wearing a flannel work shirt and carrying a heavy canvas tool bag in his left hand, his right hand holding his car keys. His movements were natural, relaxed, and entirely routine. He took 3 steps toward his vintage pickup truck parked in the driveway, his boots thudding softly against the timber boards of the porch, his eyes looking up toward the mountain ridge to check the weather. In that exact millisecond, the illusion of his 37-year safety was violently shredded. Police. Don't move. Face down on the gravel. Do it now. Thorne's voice struck the morning air with the force and clarity of a flashbang grenade, instantly shattering the valley silence and causing a flock of birds to erupt from the pine trees in a chaotic, screaming cloud. The tactical operators flooded around the pickup truck, their high-intensity weapon lights exploding into a blinding, white glare that completely washed across the porch, turning the gray mist into a dazzling, surreal wall of illumination. The red laser tracking dots from the tactical rifles instantly materialized across Charles Vance's chest, dancing like small, bleeding pinpricks of fire against the fabric of his flannel shirt. The transformation that occurred within the suspect's body was chillingly instant and absolute. The slow, arthritic grandfather vanished within the space of a single heartbeat. His jaw went completely rigid, his shoulders locking with a sudden, primitive kinetic energy as his eyes tracked the flashlights. He didn't scream, He didn't drop to his knees in a state of panicked surrender. His canvas tool bag slipped from his fingers, hitting the wooden porch floor with a heavy, metallic clatter of wrenches and chisels, but his right hand remained perfectly static, frozen in space, just inches from his waistband. His pale blue eyes, wide and completely wild beneath his silver eyebrows, locked onto Thorne's gold shield with an intensity that held no human remorse, no fear, and no morality. Only a cold, burning hatred for the machine that had finally uncoiled from the dark to strike him down. Charles Edward Vance, Thorne read, his voice dropping into a hard, rhythmic cadence that rose above the low hum of the tactical truck engines. He stepped up the porch stairs, his weapon pointed directly at the suspect's chest, his eyes never leaving the older man's pupils. "This is the Atlanta Police Department Homicide Bureau and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your run is over, Charles. The state of Georgia has taken custody of your body, and the genetic trail has officially reached its end." The elderly fugitive let out a short, wheezing gasp that sounded like a low, bitter hiss, a sound that carried the distinct rattle of a predator caught in an absolute trap. He looked at the lasers on his chest, then at the black tactical vest surrounding his porch, and a slow, terrifyingly faint curling of his lips emerged through his silver beard, a final, sociopathic gesture of cold amusement that sent a primal shiver of dread down the detective's spine. He slowly raised his hands above his head, his car keys clinking sharply against his fingers like tiny iron bells in the quiet air. "Genetic genealogy," Vance whispered, his voice a rough, dry thread that had lost its smooth, high-society Atlanta polish, turning into a jagged, cold rasp that reflected decades of mountain isolation. He turned his back to the flashlights with a calm, deliberate compliance that felt more insulting than an act of physical resistance, placing his thin wrists behind his waist to receive the steel cuffs. "You brought a federal assault column into these mountains because of a computer algorithm, Detective. You've spent 41 years chasing a phantom, and you think your modern machines have won the game. But you haven't changed a single variable that matters. I lived 37 years in this valley as a free man. I watched the seasons change. I breathed the air. I enjoyed the luxury of absolute peace while that little socialite was nothing but a forgotten case log in your basement vault. You didn't beat me, Thorne. You just arrived to collect the bones after the game was already played." The heavy stainless steel handcuffs snapped shut over his wrists with a sharp, definitive double click that resonated through the quiet valley, breaking his 41-year run of total freedom. The second cuff followed instantly, locking the fugitive's hands together in a metallic embrace that stripped him of his stolen identity forever. "The bones are going back to the red clay, Charles," Thorne said, his voice quiet, steady, and carrying the absolute finality of fate as he grabbed Vance's shoulder to lead him down the porch steps. "And you aren't going back to your antique shop. You aren't going back to your garden. You're going to an interrogation room downtown. And then you are going to a maximum security cage where the walls are concrete and the silence lasts forever. Let's move him out." While the tactical enforcement column secured the suspect inside the rear cell of the armored transport van, a secondary, equally dramatic sequence was unfolding inside the cabin. Agent Cruz and a team of 4 federal evidence technicians, dressed in full-body white protective suits and heavy nitrile gloves, stepped past the threshold into the timber frame cottage, carrying portable digital scanners and chemical light sources to initiate a comprehensive, structural search of the fugitive's fortress. The interior of the cabin was a masterclass in psychological denial and physical precision. The rooms were immaculately clean, organized with the fastidious, near-obsessive structure of a craftsman who tolerated zero error in his work. On the walls hung framed photographs of local community events, church fundraisers, and hiking trails along the Blue Ridge, the public artifacts of a gentle, grandfatherly illusion. But as Cruz moved into the rear workshop, where the heavy scent of old cedar, varnishes, and iron tools filled the air, the multispectral digital sensors began to strip away the surface veneer of the old craftsman's life. "We have a structural anomaly along the eastern wall paneling, Agent Cruz," the technician announced, pointing a specialized acoustic pulse sensor toward a massive, antique oak storage cabinet that sat bolted directly into the timber frame of the room. The density returns show a vertical void hidden behind the false wood backing, a localized concealment compartment that was built into the structure using professional carpentry methods. It's an intentional vault. Crews stepped forward, using a small crowbar to carefully slide open the concealed magnetic latches hidden within the cabinet's decorative molding. The false wood paneling clicked open smoothly, sliding back to reveal a dark, dust-free interior compartment that had been hidden from human eyes for decades. Resting inside the velvet-lined vault sat a single, heavy, vintage steel security box, a lockbox manufactured in Atlanta in the early 1980s. The technical crew moved in with clinical speed, utilizing an automated lock-picking system to bypass the physical keyway, the internal tumblers releasing with a sharp, definitive snap that broke the final perimeter of the fugitive's secrets. As crews lifted the heavy metal lid, the blinding light of her tactical flashlight shone down into the interior of the lockbox, illuminating a sight that caused her breathing to freeze completely, her hand clenching the edge of the iron cabinet until her knuckles turned a bloodless white. Resting inside the steel tray, like a collection of macabre trophies preserved by a predator who valued his control over human life more than his own safety, sat the original, personal tokens stolen from Evelyn Montgomery's bedroom on August 20th, 1985. There was her gold-plated Rolex watch, its delicate mechanical hands permanently stopped at exactly 1:54 p.m., the precise minute the Buckhead Estates security system had been manually disarmed in the dark. Beside the watch lay a silver-plated compact mirror engraved with her initials, YEM, its polished surface holding a fine layer of ancient caliche dust. And beneath the jewelry sat a small, leather-bound corporate notebook, the private financial ledger of the Montgomery Trust joint venture, its interior pages containing handwritten calculations of the multi-million-dollar land titles that Charles Vance had embezzled before skipping the state line. Trophies confirmed Marcus. Agent Cruz spoke into her communication radio, her face pale beneath her safety glasses as she looked at the pristine forensic payload. He didn't just run from the crime. He carried the pieces of her life with him into the mountains. He kept them locked in his workshop for 37 years like an administrative record of his own malice. The physical corroboration is total. The Phantom of Buckhead has no legal options left on the board. Outside the cottage, the morning sun was finally breaking through the dense mountain fog, casting long, pale shafts of light across the gravel driveway as the armored transport van accelerated toward the highway, its tires kicking up loose stones as it turned south toward the Georgia state line. The path of justice, tracking through the invisible landscape of human biology and digital genealogy, had finally cut its way through the hardest rock, tearing the predator out of his quiet paradise and delivering him back to the red clay of the city he had terrorized. The illusion of his absolute escape was entirely destroyed, the trophies were secured, and the long, brutal march toward a final trial had officially crossed the point of no return in a metropolis that was about to wake up to a Chandong that would rewrite its history from the bedrock up. Atlanta 1985 cold case solved. Genetic genealogy traps fugitive living under fake identity, Part 5 of 11. The armored transport vehicle entered the secure subterranean delivery portal of the Atlanta Police Department Homicide Bureau on Peachtree Street at precisely 1:45 p.m. on Tuesday, June 23, 2026. The descent into the fluorescent-lit concrete basement was accompanied by the heavy, mechanical resonance of armored tires scrubbing against the slick epoxy flooring and the abrupt, violent clanging of the automated steel security gates locking the outside world away. The transition from the rural, fog-enshrouded serenity of the North Carolina mountains to the clinical, high-security grid of the Central Detention Complex was instantaneous, cold, and total. Outside the reinforced concrete walls, the mid-afternoon Atlanta sun was beating down with a savage, dawn-dap intensity that caused the city's modern glass skyscrapers to shimmer like pillars of burning mercury, but inside the basement booking tier, the atmosphere was thick with the chilling, static aura of a historical day of judgment. The public unmasking of Thomas Arthur as Charles Edward Vance, the legendary phantom of the 1985 Buckhead heiress execution, had already triggered a digital and administrative apocalypse across the state of Georgia. The news had broken across the media landscape not as a routine investigative press brief, but as a tectonic, hyperkinetic shockwave that systemically paralyzed civilian communication feeds. The local television networks had interrupted their standard daytime broadcasting schedules with blinding, crimson-bordered title cards that flashed in relentless, Don Dapp strokes across the screens. Buckhead cold case shattered. Fugitive real estate tycoon arrested under fake identity after 37 years on the run. Exclusive trophies recovered in mountain raid. To the legacy families who inhabited the massive limestone enclaves of Buckhead, the realization that the elegant, smooth-talking operator who had shared their cocktails at the Piedmont Driving Club before executing their most prominent daughter was still alive, breathing, and trapped inside a police van was an administrative nightmare that tore their social history down to the bedrock. Inside Interrogation Room 3B, the layout was a study in absolute, institutional minimalism designed to strip away the psychological armor of the elite. The room was a windowless box of reinforced, poured concrete, washed in the flat, unyielding glare of a single recessed LED panel that emitted a continuous, low-frequency electrical hum. In the center sat a solid steel table, its frame bolted directly into the subterranean concrete slab, flanked by 3 heavy, high-density plastic chairs. Charles Vance sat on the left side of the metal table, his arms restricted by the 3-point steel security chains that linked his wrists to a heavy iron ring welded to the center of the table. He was still wearing the mud-stained flannel work shirt from his mountain workshop, but his silver hair had been uncombed during the rapid transport sequence, and his face was a pale, gray mask that looked ancient beneath the clinical white lights. Yet, despite the physical weight of the steel chains and the absolute termination of his 4-decade run of freedom, the calculated, sociopathic discipline that had guided Vance through his fugitivity layout remained eerily uncompromised. He sat with his spine perfectly rigid, his thin hands resting flatly on the steel table, his long, manicured fingers completely steady despite the coldness of the metal. His cloudy, pale blue eyes didn't dart around the room in a state of panicked disorientation. They remained fixed on the heavy double-paned observation mirror on the back wall, tracking his own reflection with an analytical, detached precision that belonged to an experienced corporate trial strategist. He looked entirely detached from the grim gravity of his surroundings, a predator who still believed his superior intellect could navigate the boundaries of the state's cage. The door handle clicked open with a sharp, mechanical snap, and lead investigator Marcus Thorne entered the room, accompanied by FBI Special Agent Elena Cruz. Thorne didn't carry a notebook or a legal docket. He carried a single, heavy, vintage steel security box, the exact lockbox that had been extracted from the false wood backing of the antique cabinet in Waynesville just hours before. He placed the metal vault down on the center of the steel table with a loud, heavy thud that echoed off the concrete walls like a distant gunshot, the impact causing the steel chains around Vance's wrists to vibrate with a sharp, metallic ring. Thorne took his seat slowly, his face an unyielding, stone-cold mask of professional focus as he reached forward, activating the digital audio recorder on the table. The small red recording light began to pulse in rhythmic, uniform strokes, a silent digital counter tracking the seconds of an absolute historical reckoning. "Let the record show," Thorne began, his voice a flat, driving baritone that carried zero emotional warmth. "This is a formal interview with a suspect identified via biometric tracking and genetic sequencing as Charles Edward Vance, born September 4th, 1951, previously operating under the fraudulent identity of Thomas Raymond Arthur. Present are lead investigator Marcus Thorne, FBI Special Agent Elena Cruz, and the suspect. The suspect has been advised of his constitutional rights under the Miranda warning, has executed the formal digital acknowledgement, and has explicitly waived the immediate physical presence of counsel for this preliminary identification sequence." Vance let out a short, wheezing gasp that sounded like a low, mocking chuckle, a dry, rattling sound that filled the small concrete room with an immediate, chilling arrogance. He shifted his weight slightly, his chains clinking against the iron ring as he looked directly into Thorne's eyes, his voice carrying a jagged, cold rasp that completely rejected the polite, blue-collar persona of the mountain craftsman. You have a very precise way of reading numbers into a microphone, Investigator Thorne, Vance whispered, his long fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern against the steel table. You sit there with your tactical vest, your digital recorder, and your federal shields, and you think you have achieved a moment of profound historical triumph because your computers matched a few skin cells on an old piece of silk. But we're not playing an academic game of biology here, Detective. We are talking about the reality of power and the geometry of time. For 41 years, your department stood before the empty space in that Buckhead master suite like a pack of blind dogs scratching at a brick wall. For 37 years, I breathed the mountain air, I drank the fresh water, and I built a life of absolute, unassailable peace under the nose of your entire federal apparatus. You didn't catch a fugitive, Thorne. You simply inherited an old account that your system was too primitive to collect when the assets actually mattered. The assets matter today, Charles, Agent Cruz interrupted, leaning forward until her forearms rested heavily on the steel table, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the suspect's silver beard. Let's talk about how you opened that account on August 20th, 1985. You weren't a quiet mountain craftsman back then. You were a high-flying, predatory real estate speculator who had just embezzled $7 million in infrastructure development bonds from the Montgomery Trust Company to fund your private options, trading, and lifestyle liabilities. Evelyn Montgomery discovered the audit irregularities on the morning of Friday, August 16th. She gave you exactly 72 hours to prepare your corporate surrender before she took her files to the state attorney. You knew that if she walked into that grand jury room, your career, your social standing, and your freedom would be permanently immolated. So you calculated a countermove. Cruz tapped her finger firmly against the steel lid of the recovered lockbox. You tracked her schedule. You knew she would be alone in her Buckhead estate on Tuesday afternoon before her dinner at the Piedmont Driving Club. You arrived at the house at exactly 1:42 p.m. You didn't breach the rear windows or break the locks. You were a frequent guest, a man she danced with at the country club, a man she trusted enough to open her front door to. You walked into that kitchen, and before she could even reach for the telephone, you forced her up the stairs at gunpoint. You made her manually disarm the security network using her master code, ensuring that the system logs would show a clean entry. And then you led her into the master suite. The older man didn't flinch as the details of the crime scene filled the room. Instead, his pale blue eyes focused on the lockbox, his jaw tightening slightly into a hard, rigid line that exposed the raw, unadulterated predator nesting beneath his silver hair. You have an extraordinary imagination, Agent Cruz, Vance said, his voice dropping into a flat, icy register that carried no human empathy or regret. You speak with the theatrical confidence of a true crime novelist. But an investigative theory is not a legal conviction. In 1985, your predecessor, Edward Vance, spent 6 months attempting to construct that exact identical narrative. He searched my office, he audited my corporate bank accounts, and he interrogated my staff until their hands shook. But he couldn't find a single print, a single strand of foreign hair, or a single drop of biological material that connected my hand to that Italian silk scarf. My alibi was verified under oath by 2 independent structural engineers who confirmed I was reviewing construction blueprints at my penthouse during the exact hour of her death. Your case was a house of cards 41 years ago, and it's a house of cards today. The passage of time hasn't made your circumstantial theories any more solid. Edward Vance didn't have the contents of this box on his table, Charles, Investigator Thorne said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing whisper that cut through the suspect's deflection like a surgical blade. He reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a specialized high-security biometric key card and sliding it into the electronic release mechanism of the recovered lockbox. The heavy steel lid of the vault released with a sharp, loud, and definitive clang that shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room like a gunshot, the metal echo bouncing off the concrete walls with a physical finality that caused Vance's breathing to freeze completely for 2 full seconds. Thorne lifted the lid slowly, revealing the pristine forensic interior. He reached inside using a pair of long, sterile plastic forceps, pulling out the first object and laying it down flatly on the steel table, directly under the blinding glare of the LED panel. It was Evelyn Montgomery's solid gold Rolex watch, its delicate mechanical hands permanently frozen in space at exactly 1:54 p.m., the precise, unalterable minute her heart had stopped beating beneath the pressure of the silk scarf. Beside the watch, Thorne placed the silver-plated compact mirror engraved with her initials, Yem, its polished glass surface still holding a fine layer of ancient caliche dust from her dressing table. And beneath the jewelry, Thorne unrolled the original, leather-bound corporate notebook, the private auditing ledger of the Montgomery Trust joint venture, its interior pages containing handwritten calculations of the embezzled infrastructure bonds, signed with Charles Vance's own original corporate signature from 1985. "Let's talk about your mountain workshop, Thomas Arthur," Thorne said, leaning over the table until his face was just inches away from the fugitives across the steel surface, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromised intensity. "You didn't just change your name when you skipped the state line in 1989. You carried the trophies of your execution with you into the wilderness. A common thief takes a watch to sell it. A professional hitman buries a ledger to destroy it. But a true sociopath keeps them locked in a secret velvet-lined vault behind his workbench because he values his control over human life more than his own survival. You kept these pieces of her stolen ambition for 37 years, Charles. You looked at them every night after you finished planing your cedar wood, using them as a private monument to your own absolute arrogance. You thought the mountain would protect you forever. But your own skin cells betrayed your name to our cyber sequencing engines, and your own carpentry methods led our radar units straight to your vault. The sight of the pristine trophies, the gold watch, the silver mirror, the signed ledger, shattered the final, frozen composure of the elderly politician. He didn't erupt into physical violence or scream a desperate denial. Instead, his entire body went perfectly rigid, the muscles along his neck standing out like thick steel cables beneath his work shirt collar. The refined, gentle mountain craftsman vanished completely within the space of 3 breaths, revealing the terrifying specter that had stood over the cream-colored carpet of the Buckhead estate in 1985. The emptiness in his pale blue eyes was total, a chilling, absolute void that held no human remorse, no morality, and no fear of judgment, only a deep, burning hatred for the modern digital network that had systematically uncoiled from the dark to destroy his perfect escape. "You think you've achieved something historic, don't you, Thorne?" Vance whispered, his teeth bared in a sinister, empty curling of his lips that sent a primal shiver of pure dread through the interrogation room. His voice lost its rough mountain timbre, turning back into the razor-sharp, smooth baritone of the corporate predator he had always been. "You come here with your genetic genealogy, your DNA extraction sequencers, and your joint federal task forces, and you think you've balanced the ledger for the Montgomery family. But you haven't changed a single variable that matters in the arithmetic of life. For 41 years, I lived exactly the life I chose to live. I was the golden child of the city's boom. I enjoyed the luxury of absolute freedom, wealth, and peace while that brilliant little heiress was nothing but a cold name carved into a marble headstone in Oakland Cemetery. I won the game, investigator. I won it every single day, for 4 decades. This room isn't your victory. It's just the closing of an old account after the money has already been spent." Thorne stood up slowly, his plastic chair producing a sharp, scraping shriek against the concrete floor that shattered the dark, suffocating energy of the confrontation. He reached down, locking the steel security box with a definitive snap, looking down at the fugitive with a profound, unyielding disgust that carried the accumulated weight of his father's uncompromised investigative career. "The account isn't closed until the cell door clicks shut, Charles," Thorne said, his voice quiet, steady, and carrying the absolute finality of fate. "And you aren't going back to your mountain workshop. You aren't going back to your garden. You are going to a federal maximum security tier where the walls are gray, the lights never go down, and the silence lasts forever. Enjoy your 4 decades of peace, Senator. It's the last thing you're ever going to own." He turned the heavy brass handle of the security door, stepping out into the bright, frantic chaos of the booking room where Assistant State Attorney Victoria DeShazo was already surrounded by a massive battery of television microphones, ready to announce to the world that the Phantom of Buckhead had finally been broken. The media flashes strobed continuously through the glass partitions, their bright lenses capturing the moment the 1985 cold case officially died and the long, agonizing march toward a final, historic trial began in a metropolis that would never look at its own wealth the same way again. The institutional shockwave that erupted from the subterranean core of the Peachtree Street Police headquarters did not merely disrupt the humid evening gridlock paralyzing the downtown connector. It systematically dismantled the foundational myths upon which Atlanta's modern high society hierarchy had been meticulously constructed. By 5 p.m. on Tuesday, June 23, 2026, the strategic cordon of protective silence that had historically shielded the corporate and political dynasties of Fulton County was utterly vaporized by a relentless, dawn-dap barrage of digital alerts, emergency broadcasts, and real-time judicial filings. The city did not simply absorb the information. It fractured under the weight of an unprecedented moral and cultural vertigo. Across every news feed, transit monitor, and smartphone screen, from the towering glass structures of Midtown to the sprawling, oak-shaded plantations of North Georgia, a single headline pulsed in continuous, alarming strokes of deep crimson text. Cold case resurrection. Tycoon Charles Vance identified as Buckhead Phantom. Fake identity shattered after 37 years in the North Carolina mountains. To an outside observer detached from the historic socioeconomic landscape of the American South, the arrest of an elderly antique craftsman in a rural mountain enclave might have resembled a routine, albeit dramatic, postscript to an obscure true crime ledger. But to the collective memory of Atlanta, Charles Edward Vance was not a common criminal passing through the night. He was a primary architect of the city's post-civil rights economic renaissance. He was the golden child whose predatory corporate maneuvers had helped orchestrate the flow of international capital into the financial district, whose name sat embedded within the original legal titles of multi-million-dollar shipping and transit plazas, and whose early social prestige had been celebrated within the most exclusive, old-guard country clubs of Peachtree Street. The sudden, terrifying revelation that this revered pioneer was a cold-blooded saboteur, the literal monster who had manually throttled a 28-year-old heiress inside her own sanctuary to preserve his fraudulent financial empire, was a truth so structurally grotesque that it threatened to drag the entire civic establishment down into the red clay. Inside the Grand Briefing Theater on the 5th floor of the Central Police Bureau, the atmosphere had deteriorated into a suffocating, high-intensity pressure cooker of modern investigative journalism. The specialized industrial air conditioning units groaned helplessly against the heavy, humid body heat generated by over 300 print, broadcast, and digital correspondents who had packed themselves shoulder to shoulder into the wood-paneled space. Camera operators waged a silent, aggressive war for positioning along the elevated technical risers, their iron tripods clinking sharply against the floor tiles while a massive, dense forest of directional microphones sprouted from the central oak podium like a digital thicket. The sound of high-speed digital camera shutters producing a continuous, mechanical clicking filled the room with an ambient static that resembled a sudden hailstorm tearing through a plate glass window, cutting through the low, anxious hum of whispered telephone dictations and frantic script adjustments. When Fulton County District Attorney Victoria DeShazo stepped up to the microphones, flanked by lead investigator Marcus Thorne, FBI Special Agent Elena Cruz, and the Regional Director of Public Safety, the sudden blast of electronic studio flashes was so intense it turned the podium into a blinding, whitewashed arena. DeShazo was a prosecutor who had spent 25 years navigating the high-stakes, often lethal intersections of institutional corruption and organized financial crime, but her face today was an unyielding mask of absolute finality. She laid her hands flatly on a blue leather folder containing the multi-layered state capital indictment, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly into the glass lenses of the center television cameras that were broadcasting her statement live to a stunned international audience. "Good afternoon," DeShazo began, her voice carrying a sharp, driving resonance that instantly flattened the frantic room into a breathless, static silence. 41 years ago, the city of Atlanta was scarred by an act of calculated, intimate, and state-insulated violence. The murder of Evelyn Montgomery inside her Buckhead residence on August 20th, 1985, was not a random tragedy, nor was it a burglary gone wrong. It was a structural execution, a cold-blooded silencing of a brilliant financial mind who had dared to audit the dark cash flows undergirding a massive corporate real estate scam. For more than 4 decades, the history books treated this vanishing as an unresolvable myth, a ghost story buried beneath the concrete foundations of our city's rapid expansion. Today, the state of Georgia is here to declare that the red clay has officially given up its secrets. She paused, allowing her eyes to lock onto the front row of political columnists who sat frozen over their open notebooks. Earlier this morning, acting under the authority of a capital warrant charging first-degree murder, kidnapping, and corporate embezzlement, a joint task force took physical custody of Charles Edward Vance in Waynesville, North Carolina. For 37 years, this individual has evaded federal and state justice by executing a comprehensive identity theft layout against a deceased child, living a life of quiet anonymity as an antique craftsman. This arrest was made possible through the application of advanced genetic genealogy, a scientific miracle that mapped the suspect's epithelial skin cells, left deep within the knots of the murder weapon in 1985, against public ancestral databases. Furthermore, during a tactical raid on the suspect's mountain workshop, federal agents recovered a concealed forensic vault containing the original personal tokens stolen from the victim, including her gold Rolex watch and the signed corporate ledgers documenting the suspect's original financial fraud. The law does not care how long a fugitive runs. We do not care what name you carve into your porch or how peaceful your stolen life appears to your neighbors. Justice is an absolute, unyielding arithmetic that eventually balances its ledger, no matter how deep the wilderness or how long the night. The state will move for absolute detention without bail at the arraignment tomorrow morning. The moment DeShazo stepped back from the podium, the room exploded into a chaotic, screaming wall of sound, with dozens of journalists leaping onto their chairs, shouting questions about the involvement of the old banking networks, the financial liabilities facing the Montgomery Trust, and the emotional reaction of the surviving Montgomery heirs. Investigator Marcus Thorne remained completely motionless behind the prosecutor, his arms crossed over his tactical vest, his eyes fixed on the rear exit door. He was not listening to the media performance or the political rhetoric of the briefing. His mind was focused entirely on the immediate, savage legal warfare that was already developing in the court clerk's office downstairs. Charles Vance was not a common street offender who would sit passively in a county tier while the state methodically prepared its trial sequence. He was a multimillionaire operator who, despite his decades in the mountains, still possessed deep cover connections to every elite legal mind in the state of Georgia. Even before the armored transport van had cleared the basement expressway gates, Vance's corporate defense apparatus, activated by a prearranged emergency trust fund he had established before his flight in 1989, had launched a massive, multi-tiered counteroffensive designed to neutralize the state's biological evidence before a single document could be presented to a trial judge. By 4:30 p.m., a defensive phalanx of 5 of the highest-priced, most ruthless criminal defense specialists in the American South had materialized at the Fulton County Courthouse, led by senior trial counsel Harlan the Iron Gate Pendleton, an old-money defense titan known for dismantling capital prosecutions through brutal, microscopic attacks on forensic methodology and digital chain-of-custody protocols. Thorne walked down the long, echoing limestone corridor of the courthouse's 9th floor, his heavy combat boots producing a sharp, rhythmic thud that signaled his internal velocity. He pushed open the double doors of the task force's temporary command center, where Detective David Miller was surrounded by stacks of historical 1985 mapping dockets, industrial blueprints of the old Chattahoochee development sectors, and a live monitor tracking the local high society reactions. The television on the wall showed a live broadcast from the plaza outside Oakland Cemetery, where groups of stunned citizens were gathering in silence, their faces illuminated by the amber glow of temporary votive candles that had been placed next to vintage photographs of Evelyn Montgomery. Harlan Pendleton just filed his initial emergency discovery and suppression demands with the circuit clerk, Miller said, looking up from his terminal as Thorne entered the room. His face was a pale mask of sheer physical exhaustion, dark circles swelling beneath his eyes from working 72 hours without a single interval of rest. He's already launching a massive, multi-pronged attack against our genetic data, Marcus. He's filed affidavits from 2 independent molecular biology firms claiming that the touch DNA sample we extracted from the Italian silk scarf is a contaminated, unverified biological artifact that has suffered from 41 years of ambient humidity, cross-contamination within the evidence locker, and systemic cellular degradation. They are going to argue that the SNP profile our geneticists compiled is a completely arbitrary interpretation, a narrative forced onto a chaotic, fragmented DNA strand by a desperate cold case task force to justify its federal budget allocation. A contaminated sample doesn't generate a specific ancestral SNP profile that leads a task force straight to the Vance Caldwell bloodline in western North Carolina, David, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a hard, quiet whisper that carried the absolute finality of the state's power. He slammed his folder down firmly onto the central table. A contaminated sample doesn't accurately pair an old family tree with a physical individual who vanished from Atlanta in 1989 under a federal fraud warrant. He didn't pull those genetic markers out of a laboratory glitch. He left them behind like bloodstains on the fabric because in 1985, he thought the forensic sciences were a primitive tool that would never learn how to look at the invisible. Harlan Pendleton can hire every medical expert from Johns Hopkins to Stanford, but they cannot argue with the physical reality of that recovered lockbox sitting in our evidence locker right now. The physical trophies are our absolute anchor. The defense isn't just attacking the science, Marcus, Miller warned, turning his screen to show a draft of a public statement currently being distributed to the media by Vance's Defense Trust. Look at the narrative they are spinning for the North Carolina community. They are framing Charles as Thomas Arthur, a gentle, peaceful, elderly craftsman who has been subjected to a gross, weaponized case of mistaken identity by a predatory Georgia police department. They are already mobilizing character affidavits from his church members, his neighbors, and the Waynesville civic organizations to paint our raid as a catastrophic administrative error. They want him out on a signature bond before the weekend news cycle can solidify the image of his true identity in the public mind. We don't let them control the clock or the arena, David, Thorne said, his jaw clenching as he pulled a secure drive from his inner vest pocket. If Harlan Pendleton wants a suppression battle, we give him one, but we do it with the physical evidence laid out on the table in front of him. I want the laboratory extraction logs from the GBI certified by the state geneticists within the hour. I want the high-definition video of the workshop cabinet breach locked into our digital evidence ledger. We don't wait for a routine scheduling conference to seat a grand jury for the trial phase. We push for an emergency arraignment tomorrow at dawn, while the city is still watching the unmasking. While Thorne was managing the tactical perimeter of the command post, a secondary, equally dramatic sequence was unfolding at the Fulton County Medical Examiner's high-security forensic pavilion on Marion Street. The contrast between the chaotic, high-stakes legal warfare of the courthouse and the cold, clinical isolation of the pathology laboratory was profound. The basement floor was washed in the harsh, mechanical hum of specialized air filtration systems and the blinding, clinical glare of high-intensity fluorescent lamps that left absolutely no room for human illusion or defensive spin. In the center of Autopsy Room 4 sat a secure, stainless steel examination table where the recovered trophies from the Waynesville mountain cabin were currently being prepared for advanced microspectroscopic analysis. Senior medical examiner Karen Vance, Marcus's sister, a brilliant forensic pathologist who had spent her entire professional life decoding the silent, physical narratives of the dead, stood beside the steel table, clad in a heavy, level 4 protective garment, positive pressure hood, and double-layered nitrile gloves. She held a specialized digital high-magnification macro lens camera in her hand, its automated sensors prepared to map the surface variations and trace residue profiles along the casing of Evelyn Montgomery's gold Rolex watch and the leather spine of the 1985 auditing ledger. Investigator Thorne stood behind the heavy, double-paned, reinforced glass viewing partition, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked onto the vintage artifacts. The room inside smelled faintly of industrial wood sealants, linseed oil from the mountain workshop, and the distinct, sharp tang of ancient paper, a scent that carried the exact atmosphere of that sweltering August afternoon in 1985. The trace analysis is going to require an extraordinary degree of microscopic patience, Marcus. Karen's voice came through the wall-mounted intercom speaker, sounding flat, analytical, and entirely detached from the political chaos of the courthouse. She adjusted her optical visor, using a long pair of plastic forceps to highlight a localized pattern of dark residue along the interior band of the gold watch. The linseed oil and furniture varnishes that Charles Vance used in his North Carolina workshop have migrated over the decades into the microscopic crevices of the watch casing. But beneath that modern artisan residue, we have located something extraordinary. The alternate light source scans show a distinct, localized pattern of desiccated, low-oxygen mineral dust that matches the exact geological composition of the caliche clay found exclusively within the foundation walls of the Buckhead Estate's master dressing room. He didn't just steal this watch. He preserved the soil of the crime scene within the gears of the trophy itself. Can you confirm the match on the ledger signatures, Karen? Thorne asked, his voice a low vibration against the glass. Yes, Karen replied, activating a high-resolution multispectral document scanner. The machine emitted a bright, green tracking bar that moved slowly across the aged paper pages of the Montgomery Trust ledger, displaying the results on a high-definition monitor behind the table. The ink dating analysis shows that the signatures on the embezzled infrastructure bond authorizations were written using a standard 1980s ballpoint matrix containing a highly specific chemical stabilizer compound that was discontinued in 1987. But more importantly, the page margins contain 3 clear, high-density latent ridge profiles that were entirely invisible to the carbon powders of 1985. Using our modern laser-induced fluorescence systems, we have pulled a complete right thumbprint from page 42. It doesn't belong to the victim, Marcus. It matches the booking card we took from Charles Vance downstairs with a 72-point verification index. It's an absolute fingerprint match. She panned the digital camera over the leather notebook, her face hardening with an intense, uncompromised gravity as she looked up at her brother through the glass window. The physical ties are unassailable, Marcus. Harlan Pendleton can claim that our genetic genealogy is an experimental algorithm until he is blue in the face, but he cannot explain how a gentle North Carolina craftsman's thumbprint ended up embedded within a stolen 1985 banking ledger hidden behind a false panel in his own workshop. The loop is completely airtight. Charles Vance thought his fake identity turned him into an invisible man, but his own vanity kept the evidence alive. He didn't just run from the murder. He curated the crime like an archivist of his own malice. The science is done. The phantom is officially trapped. Thorne stepped back from the glass window, letting out a long, slow breath that carried 41 years of historical failure out of his chest. He left the medical examiner's facility, stepping out into the heavy, humid air of the Atlanta evening. The traffic along Marion Street was a solid, stagnant river of white headlights and red taillights, the city moving with its standard, chaotic rhythm, completely oblivious to the fact that its historical foundation had just been balanced on a stainless steel table beneath their feet. He climbed into his unmarked command sedan, putting the vehicle in gear and accelerating north toward Midtown. He looked through his windshield at the glittering expanse of the skyline, the towering silhouettes of the corporate plazas, the high-end luxury developments lining Peachtree Street, and the grand limestone civic monuments that bore the names of the city's ruling dynasties. He realized that every light burning in those windows was an illusion. The families sleeping inside those high-end developments, the international financiers leasing those glass offices, and the progressive institutions that prided themselves on their modern virtue were all living inside a structure built on top of a hidden slaughterhouse. The unmasking of Charles Vance was not just the resolution of a cold case homicide. It was a total, systemic baseline shift that would force Atlanta to look at its own wealth and its own history with a permanent sense of shame and suspicion. The phantom was broken, the trophies were secured, and the long, brutal march toward a final courtroom showdown had officially crossed the point of no return in a metropolis that would never look at its own architecture the same way again. The heavy, Bronze-reinforced double doors of Fulton County Superior Courtroom 4A did not merely open to the public at dawn. They groaned under the immense, suffocating weight of an institutional cataclysm that threatened to pull the entire old money establishment of Georgia down into the red mud. By precisely 9 a.m. on Wednesday, June 24, 2026, the atmospheric pressure inside the expansive, oak-paneled chamber had reached a volatile, near-unbearable maximum. Every single spectator bench was packed shoulder to shoulder with senior banking executives, legacy real estate developers, and veteran political strategists from the Capitol, their faces uniform masks of pale, sleepless anxiety. Behind them, the media gallery resembled a dense, chaotic fortress of broadcast lenses, high-definition digital monitors, and national legal correspondents whispering frantically into encrypted satellite communication links. The air inside was thick, cold, and heavy, smelling of old leather-bound legal statutes, fresh ink printouts, and the sharp, chemical odor of expensive floor wax that could not fully mask the raw, distinct scent of systemic panic. This was the formal arraignment and preliminary detention review for Charles Edward Vance. For 41 years, the 74-year-old fugitive had moved through the world under the stolen identity of a deceased 5-year-old child, entirely insulated by the quiet, rustic normalcy of his North Carolina mountain sanctuary. Today, he entered the courtroom through the secure rear prisoner lockup corridor, his movements severely restricted by the heavy, rhythmic clinking of a 3-point steel restraint chain locked around his waist, his wrists, and his bare ankles. He was no longer wearing the comfortable flannel work shirt or the dusty boots of his mountain artisan persona. He stood before the bar of justice in a coarse, bright orange federal detention jumpsuit, his silver hair slightly unkempt from a night spent in a high-security isolation tier, his skin appearing dull, gray, and bloodless beneath the harsh, unyielding glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. Yet, despite the orange uniform and the physical degradation of the steel chains, the calculated, sociopathic discipline that had guided Vance through nearly 4 decades of successful flight remained eerily uncompromised. As he took his seat at the defense table, his pale blue eyes swept slowly across the gallery, mapping the faces of the city's corporate elite with a cold, piercing intensity that carried an implicit, dangerous threat. He did not bow his head. He sat with his spine perfectly rigid, his chin lifted with an air of absolute, unearned majesty that signaled his total refusal to surrender control of the narrative. Beside him stood his defensive phalanx, a $5 million array of white-collar litigation power led by senior trial counsel Harlan, the Iron Gate, Pendleton. Pendleton was a legendary figure in the Southern Bar, a towering, silver-haired master of the courts whose career was built on the systematic destruction of state forensic evidence and whose voice carried a rich, theatrical resonance that had rescued international tycoons and cartel associates from capital indictments. Across the central aisle sat the state prosecution team, commanded by Fulton County District Attorney Victoria DeShazo and lead investigator Marcus Thorne. Between the two tables sat the focal point of the entire litigation, a large, high-definition presentation monitor that currently displayed a digital image of the frozen gold Rolex watch recovered from the concealed workshop vault in Waynesville just 24 hours prior. The mechanical hands of the watch were locked in a permanent, physical stasis at exactly 1:54 p.m., a silent, unalterable record of an execution that was about to collide with the sophisticated legal armor of the defense team. The Superior Court of Fulton County is now in session, Judge Evelyn Whitmore presiding. The court-martial announced, his voice flattening the room into an instant, breathless silence. Judge Whitmore, a veteran jurist known for her unyielding adherence to procedural precision and her total intolerance for political grandstanding, adjusted her robes and looked down over her elevated bench. Her eyes locked onto the defense table, her jaw set into a firm, uncompromised line. "We are here for the formal arraignment and detention review in the matter of the state of Georgia versus Charles Edward Vance, case number 26 CR 9240. The defendant stands charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and corporate embezzlement. The government has filed a motion for permanent pretrial detention without bail. Mr. Pendleton, your client has received the formal indictment. How do you plead?" Harlan Pendleton stood up slowly, his physical posture entirely relaxed, his tailored charcoal suit draped perfectly over his broad shoulders as he leaned forward, placing his hands flatly on the mahogany defense table. "We plead absolutely not guilty, Your Honor." Pendleton's voice boomed through the courtroom, carrying a rich, theatrical resonance that instantly challenged the state's authority. He turned his head slightly, throwing a dismissive, calculated glare toward DeShazo and Thorne. Furthermore, the defense has filed an immediate, emergency motion to suppress the entirety of the genetic genealogy data, the DNA extraction profiles, and the physical contents of the security box recovered from the North Carolina property. We are asking this court to dismiss this indictment with prejudice, because what the state has presented today is not a portfolio of legal evidence. It is a predatory manipulation of experimental science designed to execute a historic character assassination against an elderly, peaceful citizen. Pendleton stepped out from behind his table, pacing the well of the court with a slow, heavy deliberation that turned the courtroom into his private theater. Let us strip away the sensational, direct-to-media rhetoric that the district attorney displayed on television yesterday afternoon. The cornerstone of the government's entire probable cause statement rests on a microscopic touch DNA sample extracted from a 41-year-old Italian silk scarf. They claim their advanced sequencers have compiled a single nucleotide polymorphism profile that connects my client to the crime scene. But they have completely failed to disclose to this court that this biological artifact has spent nearly half a century sealed in a standard paper envelope inside a baseline evidence locker. It has been subjected to 40 years of ambient humidity fluctuations, systemic cross-contamination by dozens of ungloved archive clerks, and profound cellular degradation. It is a corrupted, fragmented biological mosaic. To use an unauthenticated, ancient piece of degraded skin tissue to strip a 74-year-old grandfather of his liberty is an administrative outrage that shatters every standard of due process under the 14th Amendment. Pendleton slammed a thick, blue-bound binder of scientific affidavits onto the podium, his eyes narrowing as he looked up at Judge Whitmore. "I have provided this court with sworn statements from two of the leading molecular biologists at the Harvard Medical School. They have analyzed the GBI's laboratory extraction logs and have stated under oath that the touch DNA sample utilized by investigator Thorne's team is completely unreliable. It is a highly contaminated, low-yield biological artifact that has suffered from severe secondary transfer. If you alter a single variable in their genetic sequencing algorithm, the name Charles Vance vanishes entirely from the ancestral family tree, replaced by random genetic noise. You cannot incarcerate a human being based on a mathematical model that changes its answers depending on which commercial database it queries." Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses, reviewing the defense affidavits on her digital screen, her expression remaining entirely illegible. She turned her gaze toward the prosecution table. "Ms. DeShazo, the defense is raising a fundamental challenge regarding the authenticity and structural integrity of your biological origin point. If your touch DNA sample is a corrupted artifact of cellular degradation, your probable cause matrix begins to fracture. How does the state respond to the defense's technical analysis?" District Attorney DeShazo did not stand up immediately. She allowed Pendleton's theatrical echo to fully fade from the room, letting the silence become heavy and uncomfortable before she slowly rose from her chair, holding a single, slim white folder in her hand. She did not slide documents across the table. She walked straight to the podium, her voice cutting through the defense's rhetoric with the sharp, clean precision of an executioner's axe. "Your Honor, counsel's performance is a brilliant exercise in scientific obfuscation, designed to comfort the financial boards that are currently watching their real estate portfolios dissolve on the morning news," DeShazo stated, her voice quiet, steady, and carrying the absolute weight of the state's power.
Trường hợp này không phụ thuộc vào giả thuyết đơn lẻ.
Harlan Pendleton can claim that our genetic genealogy is an experimental algorithm, but he has completely failed to explain to this court how an experimental algorithm possesses the supernatural capacity to predict the exact hidden coordinates of a secret forensic vault buried inside a timber frame cabin 300 miles away in the Blue Ridge Mountains. DeShazo hit a button on her console, and the digital display screen behind her transformed, replacing the image of the frozen wristwatch with a high-definition, multispectral macro lens image of page 42 of the recovered Montgomery Trust ledger. "This is not random genetic noise, Your Honor," DeShazo barked, her voice dropping into a hard, driving cadence that forced every eye in the room onto the screen. Acting on the precise ancestral lineage mapped out by that corrupted, touched DNA sample, a pipeline that isolated the Vance Caldwell bloodline and cracked my client's 37-year fake identity, Investigator Thorne's team executed a federal warrant in Waynesville yesterday morning. They did not search a general residence. They used advanced radar sensors to breach a false wood wall inside the defendant's workshop. Inside that concealment compartment, they located a heavy steel security box containing the original token stolen from Evelyn Montgomery's bedroom on August 20th, 1985. And as the monitor displays now, the GBI's Document Analysis Unit has successfully pulled 3 high-density, latent ridge profiles from the interior pages of this stolen banking ledger. These prints were completely invisible to the primitive carbon powders of the 1980s, but under modern laser-induced fluorescence, they show a 72-point verification index. That is not an interpretation of a database, Your Honor. That is an absolute physical match. The right thumbprint embedded within the blood of this financial fraud belongs to the defendant, Charles Edward Vance. Harlan Pendleton stepped forward, his face hardening as he attempted to cut off the prosecutor's momentum. The discovery of vintage artifacts inside a mountain residence is an extraordinary development, Your Honor. But it does not prove a personal involvement in a capital homicide from 1985. My client is an antique dealer, a craftsman who purchases estate liquidations, old storage lockers, and historic salvage lots across the Southeast. It is entirely plausible within the parameters of his legitimate profession that he acquired a vintage security box containing old papers without ever knowing the illicit origin of the contents. The presence of a print on an old piece of paper does not constitute proof of execution. Then let us discuss the trace mineral analysis that counsel wishes to suppress. Investigator Marcus Thorne spoke, stepping up to the podium beside DeShazo, his voice a low, gravel-heavy baritone that carried the grit of the city's streets. He pulled a certified report from his folder and laid it down firmly before the defense team. Harlan Pendleton claims his client acquired these items through routine antique salvage. But our forensic pathology team under Dr. Karen Vance performed a microspectroscopic audit of the gold Rolex watch last night. They located a distinct, localized pattern of desiccated, low-oxygen mineral dust embedded deep within the mechanical gears of the watch casing. The microchemical signature of that dust matches the exact, unique geological composition of the Caliche clay foundation walls found exclusively within the Buckhead Estate's master dressing room, a geological fingerprint unique to that single residential acre. Charles Vance didn't buy this watch at a flea market, Your Honor. He carried the dirt of the execution scene inside the trophy itself, keeping it hidden behind his workbench for 37 years like a monument to his own absolute malice. Thorne leaned over the podium, his eyes boring directly into the face of the defendant, who sat motionless at the table, his silver hair casting a slight shadow over his hardened brow. "The loops are completely closed, Your Honor. We have his genetic signature on the murder weapon. We have his physical thumbprint on the stolen banking ledgers. We have the soil of the victim's bedroom embedded within his hidden trophies." Charles Vance thought his fake identity turned him into an invisible man, but his own vanity kept the evidence alive. He didn't just run from the murder. He curated the crime like an archivist of his own evil. The technology of 1985 was too primitive to see his footprints, but the digital machine does not forget, and the red clay has finally demanded its debt. The revelation hit the interior of courtroom 4A like a kinetic blast. The gallery of corporate real estate executives and family lawyers dissolved into a sudden, frantic wave of whispered panic, their hands flying to their mobile devices to transmit the information to their respective firms. At the defense table, Harlan Pendleton stood perfectly static for 3 seconds, his jaw clenching tightly, his theatrical composure slipping for a single, brief millisecond as he realized that the state had built an unassailable bridge between the experimental genetic genealogy and the undeniable physical reality of the crime scene. The thumbprint match, paired with the specific microchemical caliche soil data, was an ironclad link that no theoretical biology argument could pull loose. Charles Vance did not move. His thin, manicured hands remained flat and relaxed on the mahogany table, but his face underwent a terrifying, subtle transformation. The slow, gentle mountain craftsman vanished entirely within the space of 3 breaths, replaced by the chilling specter that had stood over the cream-colored carpet of the Buckhead estate in 1985. His pale blue eyes stared at the multispectral scan on the presentation screen with a cold, hollow intensity that held no human remorse, no fear, and no morality. Only a quiet, burning hatred for the modern digital network that had systematically uncoiled from the dark to destroy his perfect escape. He realized that the perimeter was completely solid, that the cold case task force had constructed a cage out of his own biological and professional footprints, and that his multi-million-dollar defense team was running out of maneuvers on the board. Judge Whitmore leaned forward over her bench, her gaze shifting from the presentation screen down to the defendant, her expression one of absolute, unyielding judicial severity. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel, striking the sound block with a sharp, explosive crack that instantly cut through the whispered chaos of the room, restoring a cold, administrative silence to the chamber. Mr. Pendleton, Judge Whitmore spoke, her voice carrying a sharp, rhythmic finality that signaled the absolute end of the defense's opening gambit. The arguments regarding the potential for cellular degradation and secondary transfer within 40-year-old touch DNA samples are significant technical questions that your team may present to a jury during the full trial phase of this proceeding. However, for the purposes of a preliminary arraignment and a review of pretrial detention, the standard of proof required by this